She walked into the wedding hall knowing that every smile would soon turn into a knife. Knowing that every whisper would carry poison, knowing that this single night would decide. Whether silence was her shield or her curse, she did not come dressed in silk or diamonds. She came wrapped in calm, carrying a secret so heavy that if it fell, it would crush everyone who mocked her. And before this story truly begins, listen carefully, subscribe to this channel, and stay with this story till the very end, because every word leads to a moment that will change everything. This is not just a wedding story. This is a story of pride, cruelty, patience, and karma, and it begins with a woman who chose to pretend she had nothing, when in truth she had everything. Her name was Eleanor Blake, and she was the kind of woman people ignored easily. She spoke softly, walked gently, and never raised her voice. She was born into a middle-class family where love was limited and comparison was constant from a young age. Eleanor learned that among her relatives, kindness was weakness and wealth was power. Her Aunt Margaret ruled family gatherings with her sharp tongue and louder laughter, while her cousin Vanessa grew up believing the world owed her luxury. Eleanor, on the other hand, learned to survive in silence. She studied hard, worked quietly, and dreamed modestly. Her relatives often reminded her that she was ordinary, that she would never marry well, never rise high, never be more than a background figure at family events, and Eleanor accepted those words not because she believed them, but because she understood arguing with shallow minds only wastes breath. Life, however, had a different plan. Far away from the noise of her relatives, Eleanor met Julian. Read, a man who dressed simply, drove an old car, and spoke with depth. He listened when she spoke, he respected her pauses, and he saw her not as poor, not as ordinary, but as rare. What Eleanor did not know at first was that Julian Reed was the owner of a global business empire, a self-made billionaire who avoided the spotlight and valued privacy above praise. Their love grew in quiet corners, coffee shops, late-night walks, and conversations that healed old wounds. When Julian revealed the truth about his wealth, Eleanor was shocked not by the money, but by how little it changed him. They married quietly without inviting her relatives. Not out of revenge, but out of peace. Eleanor chose to keep her new life separate. She did not want money to become the only reason her family looked at her differently. Years passed, and Eleanor lived a life of comfort, dignity, and purpose, supporting charities, building schools, and standing beside her husband as an equal, not a trophy. Then one day, an invitation arrived. Vanessa was getting married, and it was to be the wedding of the year. Luxury hall, famous guests, designer, everything. Margaret personally called Eleanor, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, telling her she must attend, saying, "After all, family is family." Eleanor hesitated. She knew the insults, the looks, the humiliation that waited for her, but something inside her told her it was time not for revenge, but for truth. She decided to attend alone without Julian. She chose a simple dress, no brand, no shine, no statement, just herself. When she entered the wedding hall, conversations slowed, eyes turned, and judgment began. Immediately, whispers followed her steps. Some laughed quietly, others openly. Her aunt looked her up and down with a smirk and loudly asked if Eleanor had come to serve food. Vanessa, the bride dressed in layers of gold, glanced at Eleanor with disgust and asked how she even managed to get an invitation. Eleanor smiled politely, congratulated her cousin, and handed over a modest gift. The laughter that followed was sharp. Vanessa opened the gift and mocked it, calling it cheap, useless, and embarrassing. Guests joined in. Someone suggested security remove her for lowering the standard of the event. Margaret nodded proudly as if this cruelty was a performance she had rehearsed for years. Eleanor stood still, absorbing every word, every laugh, every stare. Not a single tear fell, not a single word of defense left her lips. She was escorted out as cameras recorded her exit, labeling her the poor cousin who did not belong outside under the cold lights. Eleanor took a breath and made a call, her voice calm as she spoke just 3 words: "You can come now." And with that, the first act of this story ends. But do not go anywhere, because what follows will turn pride into panic and laughter into regret. And this was only the beginning. The night air outside The wedding hall felt heavier than the insults Eleanor had just endured, yet her face remained calm, as if nothing had happened around her guests. Inside continued laughing, dancing, drinking, unaware that the foundation of their pride was already shaking. Eleanor stood near the entrance, remembering every word, every look, not with anger, but with clarity. She had spent her whole life watching people reveal who they truly were when they believed they held power, and tonight they had exposed themselves completely. Minutes passed, and luxury cars kept arriving one after another. Then suddenly, a silence began to crawl through the crowd as a black convoy stopped at the entrance. Doors opened, and men in tailored suits stepped out first, scanning the area. Guests paused, confused. Whispers replaced music, heads turned, phones lifted. Then Julian Reed stepped out. His presence alone commanded attention, not because of flashy clothes, but because of the calm authority in his walk. Many recognized him instantly. Gasps followed, murmurs spread like wildfire. Some rushed to greet him, others froze, unsure why a man of his stature would arrive unannounced at a wedding like this. Julian did not look around searching for applause. His eyes looked only for Eleanor, and when he saw her standing quietly aside, he walked straight to her, took her hand, and asked softly, "Are you all right?" That single sentence shattered the illusion the guests had built. The laughter died. The music stopped. Vanessa turned pale. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Whispers grew louder. Who is she? Why is he holding her hand? Someone recognized Eleanor, then recognition spread like fire through dry grass. Realization hit them all at once. Eleanor was not poor, she was not ordinary, she was the wife of the man they had just insulted publicly. The bride dropped the gift box she had mocked earlier. Her smile vanished, replaced by fear. Guests stepped back as if Eleanor had suddenly become untouchable. Julian turned to the crowd, his voice calm but firm. He thanked them for showing him how his wife was treated in her own family. He spoke about dignity, respect, and how money reveals care. It's not worth every word. Cut deeper than shouting could. Security stood frozen, unsure who to obey. Now Vanessa tried to speak, her voice shaking. Margaret attempted, laughter calling it a misunderstanding, but Julian raised his hand, silencing them. He revealed how Eleanor had quietly funded hospitals, schools, and charities, many of which the guests praised without ever knowing her name. He revealed how the wedding hall itself was owned by his company, how the brands worn by the bride were part of his investments. Shock turned to horror, pride collapsed into shame. Guests avoided eye contact, phones lowered, no one dared speak. Julian announced that all contract sponsorships and future business with those who disrespected his wife were terminated, effective immediately. Partners panicked, calls were made, but it was too late. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice steady. She said she came only as family, not as wealth, and she left only with truth. Then she walked away with Julian as the wedding dissolved into chaos. Tears, accusations, panic filled the hall. Friendships broke, alliances ended, and a celebration turned into a nightmare. Outside, Eleanor breathed freely for the first time that night. Julian kissed her forehead, proud not of revenge, but of her strength. And this was only the second act, because consequences do not end in one night. Stay till the end, because karma was only beginning to collect its debt. The morning after the wedding, the city woke up to headlines, whispers, and sudden silence. Where noise once lived, news of what happened spread quietly through business circles, not as gossip, but as warning. Contracts were frozen, meetings canceled, calls unanswered. Margaret woke up believing she could explain everything, laugh it off, blame emotions, but when she reached for her phone, no one answered her. Long trusted connections vanished overnight. Vanessa sat surrounded by expensive gifts that suddenly felt like stones. Her husband argued with lawyers on speaker voices. Tense words like breach, termination, reputation loss echoed through the room. Sponsors pulled out venues, demanded payment. Brands requested their products back, claiming association damage. What was meant to be the happiest week of her life became a spiral of panic. Inside Eleanor and Julian's home, the atmosphere was calm. Sunlight filled the rooms. Eleanor prepared tea as she always did, unchanged by the storm. Outside, Julian watched her with quiet admiration, knowing her strength had never depended on money. He asked if she felt regret. She shook her head and said she felt relief for the first time. The truth was no longer hidden. Meanwhile, Margaret tried to visit Eleanor, showing up unannounced, tears, ready apologies rehearsed, but security politely refused entry, reminding her that respect was required. Vanessa sent long messages blaming stress, jealousy, misunderstanding. Eleanor read none of them. Days passed and consequences deepened. Margaret lost her board position when partners questioned her judgment. Vanessa's husband discovered debts hidden behind the wedding glamour, and trust cracked. Irreversibly, friends who once praised them now avoided them, fearing association. Eleanor finally agreed to meet them, not out of pity but closure. They sat across from her, unable to meet her eyes. Eleanor spoke gently, saying she never wanted revenge, only dignity. She reminded them how cruelty costs more than kindness, how silence can be power and patience can be justice. She forgave them, not because they deserved it, but because she deserved peace. Julian stood beside her, silent but firm. Margaret left broken. Vanessa left changed the world. Outside continued its rhythm, but for Eleanor a chapter closed and another opened one, where she no longer hid, not to impress but to inspire. And if you are still here, stay with this story, because the final reckoning and true redemption are yet to come. Weeks passed, and the dust from that night settled, but its weight pressed heavier with each sunrise. Businesses once thriving under family names began to collapse quietly. Bank accounts were reviewed, audits opened, and questions rose that could no longer be silenced. Margaret tried to hold on to dignity, attending social events with forced smiles, but doors closed politely. Invitations stopped coming. Her voice, once loud in gatherings, now echoed only in empty rooms. Vanessa faced harsher reality. Her marriage strained under financial pressure. Her husband blamed her arrogance. She blamed fate, but deep down she remembered Eleanor standing calm while she laughed. That memory haunted her nights. Eleanor, on the other hand, returned to her routine, visiting schools she supported, sitting with children, listening to dreams. Julian watched how she transformed pain into purpose and knew why the world bent for her, not because of wealth, but because of grace. One afternoon, Eleanor received a letter, handwritten, not an email, not a call. It was from Vanessa. Words, shaky apologies, raw, no excuses, just regret. Eleanor read it slowly, feeling neither anger nor joy, only understanding. She chose not to reply immediately. Instead, she visited her childhood neighborhood, remembering who she was before judgment, before silence. She realized this story was bigger than revenge. It was about breaking cycles. When Eleanor finally responded, her message was simple: grow, learn, choose kindness. She offered no money, no rescue, only wisdom. Margaret never wrote. She could not face what she had become. Months later, news arrived that Vanessa filed for divorce, choosing independence over illusion. She started working quietly, learning humility from the ground up. The wedding photos that once symbolized pride now reminded her of loss. Eleanor heard this without comment, knowing change cannot be forced, only chosen. And as seasons turned, Eleanor and Julian stood together, stronger, not because they won, but because they remained true. And if you think this is the end, stay with this story, because the final part reveals how true power is not shown in destruction, but in what you build after the storm. Time moved forward, carrying lessons that could not be erased, and Eleanor felt lighter with each passing day, as if a long-held weight had finally slipped from her shoulders. She no longer checked messages from the past, nor wondered how people who once mocked her were surviving. She focused on what mattered: building, creating, healing. Julian expanded their charitable foundation, not with loud announcements, but with quiet impact. Schools open, clinics improved, women were trained to stand on their own feet. Eleanor often visited these places without revealing who she was, sitting among people, listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching. She understood now that true wealth was the ability to change lives without needing applause. Meanwhile, Margaret faded from relevance. Her World shrank to memories of power she once abused, and she lived with regret heavier than any punishment. Vanessa struggled but slowly transformed, working long hours facing rejection, swallowing pride she remembered. Eleanor's calm words and four. The first time understood them one evening, months later, Eleanor attended a small community wedding, simple lights, modest food, genuine laughter. She smiled, realizing how different it felt when love not money was the center. She held Julian's hand, knowing their journey had come full circle, and this story was never about humiliating others, but about revealing truth. And if you have stayed till now, remember this lesson: kindness costs nothing, but cruelty costs everything, and sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the greatest power. Years later, when people spoke about that infamous wedding night, it was no longer with gossip or laughter, but as a lesson whispered carefully. Eleanor had become a quiet legend, not because she sought attention, but because her story traveled on. Its own strength. Young women spoke of her patience. Business leaders spoke of her integrity, and those who once believed power meant humiliation now spoke more softly. Eleanor and Julian chose to step further away from elite circles, living part of the year in peaceful towns where no one knew their names. There, Eleanor rediscovered herself, not as a wife of a billionaire, not as the mocked cousin, but simply as a woman who survived without losing her soul. One afternoon, she received unexpected news. Vanessa had opened a small community center for women, teaching skills and confidence using what little she had rebuilt from scratch. She requested a meeting, not for help, but for blessing. Eleanor visited quietly, watched from a distance, saw genuine effort, not performance, and for the first time felt pride, not in victory, but in transformation. Margaret, on the other hand, remained trapped in her past, unable to grow, unwilling to accept responsibility. Her loneliness became her mirror. Eleanor felt no hatred, only sadness, understanding that some lessons arrived till late life continued with gentle rhythm, and Eleanor finally understood why fate had allowed her humiliation. It was never to destroy others, but to reveal herself. And as this story moves toward its final chapter, remember this truth: sometimes karma is not loud, it is slow, patient, and unavoidable. This is the final chapter, the moment where every silence finds its meaning, and every wound turns into wisdom. Years had passed gently, like pages turning without noise, and Eleanor often reflected on how one single night had reshaped so many lives, not with explosions or shouting, but with truth standing still. She and Julian sat one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky soft gold, the same color people once worshipped without understanding its emptiness. Eleanor smiled, knowing she no longer needed to hide nor prove anything. Her journey had never been about becoming powerful, it had been about remaining human. News arrived quietly that Vanessa's community center had grown. Women who once depended on broken systems were now standing independently, teaching others. Hope multiplied without Eleanor's name attached. And that made her happiest. She chose to visit one last time, not as a savior, but as a witness. Vanessa greeted her, not with fear or shame, but with humility and gratitude. No excuses, no tears, just growth. Eleanor hugged her, gently closing a chapter that once burned with humiliation. Margaret's story ended without drama alone, but not forgotten. Her fate became a silent reminder that pride without reflection leads only to isolation. Eleanor felt peace, knowing she did not need revenge, for life itself balances the scales eventually. She and Julian established a foundation in Eleanor's name, not to honor wealth, but resilience. Scholarships were given to girls judged too quickly, ignored too easily. Eleanor spoke at events, telling her story, not naming villains, not glorifying pain, but teaching strength. She told audiences that pretending to be poor was never the point, remaining rich in character was. And as her words traveled across screens and hearts, people learned that kindness outlives cruelty, and silence, when chosen with strength, can be louder than insults. And now, as this story ends, remember this lesson: the people who mock today may kneel tomorrow, but true victory is when you no longer need them to. And if you stayed till the end, subscribe for more stories like This because some stories do not just entertain, they change how we see the world, and this was one of them.